Welcome to Never Rewrite. I'm Isaac Askew.
And I'm Jeffrey Sherman, and today we're going to discuss situations where you can't iterate. Long-time listeners and anyone who just looks at the title of the show will guess that we are big fans of iteration, do lots and lots of small, low-risk releases. And in the past, in the dark days of software development, as much as 10 years ago, really, uh, software used to be much more big release driven, where I worked at a SaaS back in around 2008, and they had quarterly releases. We would roll out software to our customers every quarter, and hopefully they would upgrade, and sometimes they would refuse. And then the bug reports would come in. So you'd have this big push to get everything into the release that you wanted to get into the release. And then because there's so much stuff, you would have a steady stream of bug reports coming back. And you would have to, there would be a period where you'd have to burn in the new release, and then things would calm down and you'd get to work on the next release. And that's terrible. It's not a good cycle. But there are still situations in the modern software world that push you to have fewer, larger releases. Some of the most obvious being if you've got an app like that goes on a phone and you have to get it through the app approval process, that's going to push you to have fewer, larger releases. If you've got legal requirements, from my experience, when there's a law or regulation change, it usually says on this date, change the software, right? At start of business on this date, which is frustrating because it's like, well, everyone I did a lot of time on Wall Street, and they would change the regulation. It'd be like, okay, Friday, your software works like this. Monday, everyone's software works like that. And everyone has to change all at once. And you can't change early.
There's no built-in grace period or something?
No. Right? There's no period where you could be either way, just pick one and just let us know what you're doing. That's just not how legislators write laws for good or bad.
Not either way, but where it's like you need to be done by this date. But Google does sometimes where they say, hey, never mind, you got 30 days because of all the pushback because no one can reasonably get this done fast enough, that kind of thing.
Well, what invariably happens in those situations is they say, hey, everyone, this new law has come out, right? It says you have to implement this stuff by say September 1st, 2025. And everyone's like, okay. And so the first thing they do is they ignore it until July of 2025. And then everyone scrambles, and then everyone says, hey, we can't really get it all done. It's too hard. We fucked up. They don't say that. They just say it's too hard. Our legal departments were too slow, yada, yada, yada. And then the regulator says, okay, fine. We'll push it back 6 months. And then everyone goes back to ignoring it for 6 months. And then eventually, at some point, the regulator says, okay, this is the new date. Everyone be ready. And eventually everyone does it. And there are problems. And if we're talking Wall Street, what Wall Street does is they do weekends where they have the new software running. So it's like, on weekdays, this is how trading systems work. But on weekends, when the markets are closed, we're going to turn on all of our systems and we're going to do fake trades with the new software, and so that everyone can have burn-in time. And that works, right? That's how they do it. That's how they did it when I worked on Wall Street, which is now more than a decade ago. It sucked because all of your testing time is on the weekend.
Right.
And there were still inevitably problems because it was a big bang cutover. Right. On Friday, the software worked one way. On Monday, the software works the other way. God help you.
You need to be really careful, yeah.
Yeah. And then for funsies, you're going to run the software during non-trading hours in production. Because what could possibly go wrong there?
Sounds like a Hooked Up Friday story.
There are good ones, but I fortunately have never had that pleasure of fucking up a trading system in production. Mostly because I didn't really work on trading systems in production. It was all market data.
So, from your list there, do you have any other examples besides the law, the legal requirements?
Those are the two obvious examples, right? The app stores. I guess if you installed software that's like written out to physical hardware. So if you've got like one of those wildlife cameras where their scientists are going to drop it in the middle of a forest somewhere, so hoping that rare creatures walk along. Also, not good for upgrading continuously.
Well, I guess in those cases, you still could upgrade them. You could take them back.
Right, at some point, the scientists will go pick up the camera and bring it back and find it. Not like if you've got a Voyager where it's send it off into the stars, it's never coming back.
Actually, that's a really good example. That's always amazed me is like any of the like NASA level things that they just have to get right because you can't chance it at all. We're so used to iteration, but like back in those days, there was not much iteration. Like that's the rocket, that's the shuttle.
And there have
been in the
decent...
early like video game days, right? Before pre-internet video games, that's what you shipped. And if it was buggy, oh man, it sucks to be you.
Sucks to be you. Well, there's also, if you look at it, there's tons of probes and things that have failed due to software issues. I remember there was one rocket booster where most of the rockets were metric and one of them was in English. And so it got all the way to Mars and then we got right into the planet because the final rocket was in English units, and everyone had just assumed that since the whole rocket up to that point had been metric, the final thrusters would be in metric as well. And
what a weird mistake to make. I would assume everyone would have standardized.
And you would have been wrong, but they also assumed. So,
what a frustrating, expensive issue to run into.
Yes.
Wonder what developer did that.
All right. So now now that we've spent an episode's worth of time talking about the problem, perhaps we should switch to talking about ways to make the problem less severe. Like what could developers do? So you've got a system where you've got a situation where the system is pushing you to have fewer larger releases. And that causes all kinds of problems. Your rocket might literally crash into Mars. So what can you do to reduce all of that? The first thing you can do is lean... Oh, yeah, QA up the wazoo, which is expensive. It's expensive. Because a lot of what you're talking about is things interacting with each other. And so the first thing you can do is try to minimize the final push, the work in progress in the final push. So when I was doing quarterly SaaS releases, the weeks leading up to the end of the quarter when we were going to cut the release were chaotic. Everyone had a product, everyone had features, everyone was trying to shove them in. And just that created lots of chaos and confusion. And so the first thing you can do is, which is probably not doable in most cases, try not to have that end of quarter push to get features in. And that goes back to WIP, right? With the work in progress. If you've got 20 developers and each one of them is working on one feature, it's more likely that you're going to have the bum rush at the end of the quarter. Whereas if you had your developers team up and you had 20 developers and they're working on 5 features, then they could get in at a more regular cadence and you wouldn't have the bum rush at the end. So that
I feel like even just saying though, like try not to squeeze in features at the end of the quarter. I I doubt it's ever like an engineer trying to squeeze it in. It's usually like some force above you saying we need to have this thing in for this release.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you try not to? How do you actually just push back when people are trying to get you to get it in?
Well, if you're in that situation, you've already lost. The
Mm,
way not to the way to have it is to have less work in progress. So instead of having 20 developers work on 20 features, have your 20 developers work on 3 or 4 features so that they get done faster, right? And then so instead of 20 features all coming to be shoved in at the end of the quarter,
hmm
if you had 4 features, let's say you had teams of 4, so you had 5 features at any one time. Now you've gone from a potential bum rush of 20 to a bum rush of 5, and
Yeah.
then you've got 15 features in, and then it's the final 5 features that are now in the bum rush. So just working on less stuff at a time, right? Getting stuff done starting and finishing faster, and having less work in progress is how you avoid that. But yeah, if you
So just yeah, it sounds almost like just essentially going back in time to when you were forced to do it this way, right? So the lessons from the pre-iterative delivery era
Mhm.
are just careful planning and more QA before each release. Careful planning such that you don't have too many tasks in flight at the same time, and higher QA such that things that get in are things that are finalized and not likely to regress.
Mhm. Uh, so more modern things that you could do, and I see this a lot with apps, is your app, the installed app, is controlled and you get few releases, but the API lives on your server. And so what a lot of app developers do is they push a lot of functionality. They push functionality towards the back end
Yeah.
so that, yes, they can't fix bugs in the UI very easily, right, in the app itself, but they can fix more stuff behind the scenes because it's more API driven. So that's
Could
one thing you
they?
could do.
I wonder if they could also kind of preemptively add like feature flagged things to the front end, such that if they were done with something, like let's say something was mid-flight,
Mm-hmm.
like some API backend stuff is not done quite yet, so we're using the old version, but they predict it will be done after the release, but they don't want to wait for the
Mm.
next cycle. Maybe you could feature flag part of that, deliver the back end piece, and once the back end piece is tested, you go, okay, let's switch to the front end piece that we already had that we weren't ready to go to quite yet to use. Yeah, I wonder if that would be kind of a creative way to try to do it, since that would also be already installed on the phone.
It would. It seems like you'd probably have a high failure rate at that. Right. I mean, the idea of, okay, you're going to launch a feature darkly, call it to launch darkly. You're going to, right, the code is there, but it's not turned on. And when the back end is ready, you're going to turn it on. That could work, but if you had to make any changes to your back end or the front end wasn't fully debugged,
Yeah.
then even though it's there, you're not going to be able to turn it on. But maybe you could still test it with well, no, you can just, maybe. I suspect that there are libraries and stuff that developers now use that will allow them to greatly rebuild their UI based on config that comes from their API to get around this problem.
Yeah. I think, like, imagine this is the first thing that kind of popped into my head was like the old PHP code, the backend PHP code that would spit out all of your your front end code.
Mm-hmm.
I could imagine like swapping to an API that would return the elements that you were supposed to display. That way, you wouldn't have to worry about being blocked by a front end change or some new iteration, or some kind of creative stuff people have created in the app world, which would
Mm-hmm.
let you set the config and generate certain components without having to have built a new front end part of it. You can kind of configure the front end based off back end config. I'm just
Right. I
speculating at
imagine
this point, though.
a lot of screens, like if your thing is a very form based thing,
Yeah.
right? you could easily have your API have the ability to push new forms into the front end, and they would just render.
Yeah. Interesting.
So that's one way to do it. But another way to reduce, I guess, your risk here uh, is to use the same API for your installed app and your web page. This is actually, from my experience, it's fairly uncommon. Usually the mobile stuff would have its own API, and the web page would have a API that is somewhat different.
Hmm.
And that is a costly thing because, one, you lost the ability, you're maintaining two APIs, which has a cost.
Yeah.
And you lose out on all that incremental iterative debugging of your API. So if you can only release your mobile app, say once a month, for whatever it costs too much to get Apple to review or whatever. If your mobile app is using the same API as your website, you can update things on your website and get all that debugging information and debug your API iteratively, incremental changes, low risk incremental changes. And then the only thing you're updating on the API with your app is the UI that's consuming these low risk API changes. And so it reduces the risk because it still lets you iterate.
Yeah, I feel like that's the right way to do it, and I think the only reason people don't do it that well, at least one of the reasons I know people don't do that is they built the front end first. It's tied in with some legacy code. Then later
Mm-hmm.
they realized, oh, we should build a REST API so that we can expose some of our endpoints to a mobile app. And they never go back to like refactor the front end to use the new REST API that they've exposed for the mobile apps because they don't have time or they're lazy or whatever reason, too hard to
Too hard.
refactor it and that kind of thing. Um, but yeah, if they were in sync, that would be that's the kind of I think that's the way everyone wants it to be. No one wants to make the same changes in two different areas, or to patch one REST API and then go, oh, I guess we should patch how the front end worked to mirror
Mm-hmm.
what we expect the REST API to do.
Right. It's called a API first strategy, and it's very rare. So the idea of an API first strategy is your website uses the API, your mobile app uses the API, and customers use the API. And there's just the one API. You don't give yourself any special thing. In theory, if a customer wanted to build a whole new UI on top of your API, rock on.
Hmm. I
Um,
like that actually.
and sometimes they do, like in the SaaS model, where you have resellers or you have people building on. Um, Salesforce does not have an API first strategy, but you can imagine, like, there are lots of SaaS companies built on top of Salesforce, to use the 800-pound gorilla, where they don't even have a REST API. But companies build on top of Salesforce, and the final customer of that sub company might not even realize that they're using built on top of Salesforce. But there's an entire that you can build whatever API you want. You can build whatever UI you want. Under the covers, it's Salesforce, but customers don't really realize that.
Right.
Salesforce is a weird thing. They've got their whole ecosystem that is not a REST API, but everyone knows who Salesforce is, so it's a good example.
All right. What else?
Well, that was all I had. Mostly it's right. Reduce the amount of work in progress. Lean heavily on testing, and reuse your API so that you can iterate on it outside of the part that is constrained. Right? A
And
lot of it,
maybe
I guess,
feature
is
flag.
yeah,
Depending.
maybe feature flag things in the hope that you can turn them on mid-release or during the mid-release cycle. Argue with the lawyers. I don't
There you
recommend
go.
that one.
push back on legal
Push-
compliance.
Yeah, but I don't recommend arguing your interpretation of the law as software development. That is a bad choice. We haven't done a bad choice episode recently. We should do one of those.
Oh, to highlight the good choices.
I like terrible ideas.
Yeah. Okay. We'll do that one.
Well, anyway,
some kind of terrible idea one.
I
Cool. Or
think
last one, you could switch jobs to a place that iteratively delivers and avoid
Right.
the problem.
you could switch jobs to a place that does not have apps or legal requirements or installed software.
No.
I believe that place is called. I don't know what that
Open
place would be.
source, hobby world.
Open source, right? Yeah, you're probably not going to get sued for writing really bad code or flaky things. It's right there in the license. You don't take any responsibility for anything. Also, people aren't going to pay you, so I guess step one, be independently wealthy.
Yeah. All right. We're done here.
Yeah, I think we are done here. All right. Thank you all for listening. I'm Jeffrey Sherman.
And I'm Isaac Askew, and this is Never Rewrite.